Leah Bennett remembered the first time she saw Charles Hart. It wasn't anything particularly special, but she couldn't shake the memory of that moment. She was 24, young, idealistic, with dreams of painting and traveling the world. At the time, she had no idea that the man sitting across from her in that crowded coffee shop would change the entire course of her life. He was sitting at a table, reading through some papers, and she noticed the way he adjusted his glasses, how effortlessly he commanded the attention of the room, without even trying. When he first spoke to her, it was like the world paused. "I'm sorry, I think you're in my seat," he said, with a slight smile, pointing to the empty chair next to him. It was one of those moments where everything just felt right, like the universe was aligning for a reason. They talked for hours that day, about everything and nothing. He asked her about her art, her hopes, and for the first time in a long while, Leah felt like someone was genuinely interested in her. It was so easy to talk to him. He wasn't just charming. He listened in a way that made her feel understood, like he actually cared. And then he asked if she'd like to meet again. She couldn't say yes fast enough. Leah was a shy, somewhat insecure woman back then. Her art was her escape. But in her heart, she was always longing for something more. Charles gave her that. He gave her the world. His passion for his work was intoxicating, and he made her feel like she mattered. He would take her to nice restaurants, to art galleries, to places she never imagined she could experience. He treated her like she was the most important person in the world. They didn't rush into anything. Their relationship was like a slow burn. But after a few months, Leah was already thinking about the future with him. A few years passed, and then they were living together in a cozy apartment, their lives intertwining more each day. It was beautiful, perfect, she thought. They had a life together, built on mutual respect and love. After 2 years, he proposed. It wasn't extravagant or over the top, but it was perfect for them. Leah remembered the way he looked at her when he asked her to marry him, his eyes full of sincerity, hope, and a little bit of fear. And she said yes without hesitation. She was so in love with him, so sure that they were meant to be together forever. They got married a year later, surrounded by family and friends, and for the first time, Leah felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. They made vows that day, promises to love each other through the good times and bad. And at that moment, she believed it. She thought their love could survive anything. The first sign that something was off came so subtly, Leah barely noticed it at first. Charles's work began to consume him in ways she hadn't expected. At first, she understood. He was ambitious, driven, and she admired that about him. But then, the late nights started to become routine. He'd come home so exhausted that he'd eat dinner in silence, barely even looking at her, and then retreat to his office to finish whatever work he had left. It was like he was physically there, but mentally somewhere else. Leah tried to make it work. She cooked dinner, tried to keep the conversation going, made sure to remind him about the little things, how his favorite book was finally back in stock, or how the weather was beautiful that day. But he was always distracted, his mind racing with deadlines and meetings. Leah started to feel invisible. She wasn't expecting him to drop everything for her, but she just wanted him to see her. She was there. She needed him. And it wasn't just about the lack of time together. It was how the little things started slipping away. He would forget anniversaries. Even the simplest gestures like telling her she looked nice or asking how her day went. It hurt more than Leah realized at the time. The silence at dinner was deafening. She tried to fill it with small talk, but he would nod absent-mindedly, eyes glued to his phone. Leah started to retreat into herself. The emptiness in the house grew louder. She spent more time in the studio, painting for hours just to escape the silence that filled their home. It wasn't that she wasn't still in love with him. She loved him with all of her heart. But he wasn't there with her anymore. Not really. And no matter how much she tried to make things feel normal, it wasn't enough. Hey there. If you want to know how this good worker husband got cheated, stay until the end. Please subscribe. It helps a lot. Thank you. It was in the midst of all this change that Andrew appeared. Leah had no intention of meeting anyone new. After all, she had Charles, and she had a life that, while lonely at times, still had meaning. But Andrew was different from anyone she had met before. He was one of her students, and he was clearly talented. His paintings were full of raw emotion and depth. But what drew her in most was how he saw her, not just as a teacher, but as someone who could offer him something more. At first, he would ask about her techniques, about the inspiration behind her work, but it soon turned into something else. They would talk about life, about dreams, about the things they wanted to create. He was so present, so focused on her in a way that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was strange at first, because he was so much younger than she was. 22, full of hope and ambition, and yet he seemed more mature than some of her older friends. Leah didn't intend for it to happen, but they started spending more time together outside of class. They'd grab lunch after a lecture, walk around the park, talk about everything and nothing. He was funny kind, and for some reason, he made her feel like she mattered. When he talked, it was like he was seeing a part of her that had been buried for years. There was something about him that reminded Leah of who she used to be, before life got so complicated. He made her feel young again, full of life, like there were still possibilities ahead of her. He paid attention to her in ways she hadn't realized she was craving. And it wasn't even about physical attraction at first. It was about the way he made her feel alive again. She could talk to him about art, about her frustrations with Charles, and about her insecurities in ways she had never been able to with anyone before. Leah told herself it was harmless, just a friendship. But the more they talked, the more the lines blurred. The way he looked at her made her heart race. And then one day, he touched her arm as they walked down the street, and she felt something inside her stir. It was a spark, small at first, but growing. And that was the moment Leah knew she was at a crossroads. She didn't want to hurt Charles. But in Andrew's company, she felt seen again, and that was a feeling she couldn't ignore. Charles's work only intensified. He was rarely home. When he'd retreat to his study, phone in hand, checking emails and making calls. They barely spoke anymore, and if they did, it was about logistics. He would ask about the dogs or mention a work trip coming up, but there was no warmth, no affection. Leah began spending more time with Andrew. They would meet for lunch, walk around the city, and talk about everything. Andrew's life was still open to possibility. He hadn't become jaded by the world yet. He reminded her of how she used to be, full of dreams, full of color. The more she saw him, the more she realized she was falling into a place she wasn't sure she could escape from. At night, Leah would lie in bed next to Charles, the space between them widening with each passing day. He would fall asleep almost immediately, his back turned to her, and she would stay awake, listening to hum of the city through the window, feeling like a stranger in her own life. She knew he was still the man she had married, but they had become so different. It felt like they were both living in the shadows of who they once were. Leah missed the days when they laughed together, when they talked for hours without realizing the time. Andrew was a breath of fresh air, but she knew deep down that something wasn't right. Still, she couldn't help but crave the attention he gave her. It wasn't love. It was more like a lifeline she was too scared to let go of. The cracks in their relationship started small, almost imperceptible at first. It was the little things, the moments Leah used to cherish with Charles that began to slip away without notice. At first, she told herself it was just a phase. that it was normal for couples to go through rough patches. But the more time passed, the more she realized it wasn't just a temporary issue. It was a slow, suffocating erosion of what they had. Charles came home later and later. Sometimes after Leah had already gone to bed, he would tiptoe through the apartment, not wanting to wake her, as though he didn't want to disturb her dreams. But it was more than that. It was as if he was trying to keep his distance, like he was afraid of the space they shared. Leah would wake up to an empty side of the bed, and even though she knew he was in the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was alone in a life she had built with someone who didn't need her anymore. Leah began to resent him, not in an angry way, but in a quiet, aching way. She resented how he'd disappear into his office after dinner, his laptop his only companion. She resented how he would come home exhausted, but never reach out to her, never ask how her day had been, as though she had become a mere afterthought in his busy life. She remembered one particular night, sitting at the dinner table alone, waiting for him. She had cooked his favorite meal, a dish she hadn't made in months, hoping to revive something between them. She set the table with care, even placed a candle in the center, an effort to recreate the ambience they had once shared, those warm evenings filled with laughter and love. But when he walked in, his eyes were glazed, his focus elsewhere. He barely noticed the effort she had put in, didn't even comment on the food. He muttered a quick thanks before picking up his phone, staring at the screen in silence. The loneliness in that moment felt unbearable. Leah could feel the weight of the years settling between them, invisible but heavy. Every word that was left unsaid, every touch that had been forgotten, filled the room with a tension she couldn't shake. She watched him eat, his face so distant, and for the first time in years, she felt like a stranger in her own home. After dinner, Charles retreated to his office, leaving Leah sitting at the table, the remnant of a meal they had once shared as a couple. The dog circled around her, sensing her sadness, but it was a silence that overwhelmed her. She wanted to cry, but there was no point anymore. The tears would change nothing. The truth was becoming clear, but Leah didn't want to face it. The foundation of their relationship was crumbling, and she didn't know how to rebuild it, or if she even wanted it anymore. One night, after weeks of silence and distance, Leah found herself texting Andrew again. It wasn't the first time. He had been messaging her about his work, and she had found excuses to respond. But this time, it was different. She was tired of waiting for Charles to notice her, tired of pretending that everything was fine. She needed someone to see her. She felt a pang of guilt as she typed the message. What was she doing? Was she betraying Charles? She didn't know anymore. But she felt so invisible for so long, and in Andrew's presence, she felt alive again. He wasn't just listening to her. He was engaging, encouraging her to be more than just an artist. He saw her as a person, a woman, not just a wife and teacher. When he suggested they meet up, Leah didn't hesitate. It was like an impulse she couldn't control, something deep inside her that longed for the kind of attention she wasn't getting from Charles. She told herself it was innocent, just a friendly meeting. But she knew the truth. She was seeking something she couldn't get at home. They met at a bar, a small, dimly lit place with an intimate atmosphere. The moment Leah saw Andrew, her heart skipped a beat. He looked different that night, more confident, more sure of himself. His eyes caught hers, and she felt that familiar warmth, that connection that had grown between them over the last few months. He smiled at her, and for the first time in a long while, Leah didn't feel invisible. They sat down, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. His words were easy to listen to, his laugh infectious. He was so present, so there with her, and Leah found herself drawn to him more than she cared to admit. She tried to fight the attraction, telling herself that she was just a lonely woman craving attention. But the more they talked, the more she realized it was something deeper. The tension between them was palpable, and it was hard to ignore. After a while, they stopped talking and just looked at each other. The air felt thick with unspoken words. And then, without warning, he leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. Leah froze. For a second, she didn't know what to do. She should have pulled away. She should have stopped him. But she didn't. She let the kiss linger, and with it, everything she had been denying, the ache inside her, the need to feel wanted, came flooding to the surface. His lips were warm, insistent, and Leah felt like she was drowning in the moment. She kissed him back, and all the guilt, all the pain, disappeared for a brief second. The kiss broke, and Leah pulled away, her breath shaky. She could see the concern in his eyes, but there was also something else, something she hadn't expected. There was a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement between them. He wasn't just seeing her as a woman in the moment. He was seeing the person she had been before life became so complicated. "You don't have to feel guilty," he whispered, his voice low. "You deserve to feel alive, Leah." And in that moment, she believed him. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that maybe she hadn't done something irreparable. But deep down, she knew that she had crossed a line that could never be undone. That night, as she drove home, Leah felt sick to her stomach, a mix of guilt and desire swirling within her. She knew she was hurting Charles, the man she had promised to love forever, but it was like she had opened a door she couldn't close. The loneliness, the emptiness that consumed her for so long, had finally found a release, and now there was no going back. The guilt started to eat away at Leah like a poison, but she couldn't stop herself. She knew what she was doing was wrong in every sense of the word, but she was so desperate for a connection, for something real. And Andrew, with his youthful energy and untainted optimism, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. She remembered the first time they were alone together, after their kiss that night at the bar. They had agreed to meet at his apartment, just to talk. But when Leah stepped inside, it was different. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but undeniable. He led her to the couch, where they sat, barely looking at each other at first. The silence between them was thick, like they were both waiting for something to happen, something they couldn't take back. And then he reached for her, and everything that had been building inside Leah spilled over. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel every nerve in her body on fire. She kissed him again, and this time, it wasn't just about feeling seen. It was about wanting something, needing something to fill the emptiness that consumed her for so long. They didn't talk much in the days that followed. Every stolen moment with Andrew felt like a violation, a betrayal of everything Leah had once believed in. But at the same time, it felt like a lifeline. She was drowning in the silence of her own life, in the absence of Charles, and Andrew was the only thing that could pull her from the depths. Leah tried to tell herself that it wasn't real, that it didn't mean anything, but it did. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word felt like a secret she couldn't carry, but couldn't let go of either. When she was with him, it felt like she was escaping, running away from everything she had built, from the life with Charles that had become suffocating. But every time she went back to their apartment, back to Charles, Leah would feel that awful, suffocating weight in her chest. She would look at him, at the man she had promised herself to, and she would feel like a stranger in her own skin. He was still the man she loved, but she had betrayed him, and with every passing day, the guilt became harder to ignore. And yet, Leah couldn't stop seeing Andrew. She couldn't stop the pull, the need to feel alive again, to feel like she was worth something. But as the days wore on, the weight of the secret became unbearable. The moments of guilt would hit her when she least expected it. When she saw Charles asleep in bed, his face soft and peaceful, completely unaware of what she was doing behind his back, or when he would ask her how her day was, and she would smile and lie through her teeth, pretending everything was fine when it was slowly unraveling in ways she couldn't control. It was inevitable. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully we bury it. And one night, Charles found the evidence, the small things that had accumulated over the past months, the little signs that could no longer be ignored. It was late when Leah got home after spending yet another evening with Andrew. She had just parked the car, her heart still pounding from the rush of seeing him, when she walked into the apartment, only to find Charles sitting in the living room, his face tight with something she couldn't place. The moment she saw him, she felt the blood drain from her face. "Leah," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, like he was trying to prepare himself for something that would shatter him. "We need to talk." Leah felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, to lie, but her body froze. The look in his eyes told her everything. It was the look of someone who already knew, who had pieced together the puzzle of her betrayal, without her saying a word. He held up the small pack of cigarettes she had been careless enough to leave in the glove compartment of her car. She had promised herself she would never get caught. She never thought Charles would look that closely, but he had, and he had found the clues she had tried so desperately to hide. And then he pulled out the condom, the one she had forgotten about, the one she had kept hidden in her bag for when she was with Andrew. Everything went silent. Leah could feel her heart breaking in her chest as she watched him process the evidence. His face twisted in confusion, pain, and disbelief. "Why, Leah? Why did you do this?" His voice cracked, and she couldn't bear it. The tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't speak. There was nothing she could say that would make this right. How could she explain this? How could she explain the emptiness, the loneliness, the crushing need for someone to see her the way she used to be seen? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen. It just did." Charles stood up slowly, like the weight of the moment was too much to bear. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months, and she saw the pain in his eyes, the hurt that was far deeper than she had ever imagined. He was broken, and she had broken him. "You don't love me anymore," he said, his voice cold, detached. "I don't know when it happened, but I can't pretend that I don't see it now. I've been watching you, and I've been waiting for you to come back to me. But you're already gone, Leah, and I can't be here with you if you're not with me." Leah wanted to scream, to beg him to forgive her, to fix everything. But she knew, deep down, that there was no going back from this. No matter how sorry she was, no matter how much pain she was in, she had shattered something that could never be put back together. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. "I never meant for it to hurt you. I love you, Charles. I never stopped loving you." But those words felt empty now, like a lie she had been telling herself for far too long. Charles didn't say anything else. He just stood there, looking at her like she was a stranger. His eyes were no longer filled with love. They were cold, distant, gone. He left that night, and Leah never saw him again. The silence that followed was deafening. The space he left behind was an ocean she couldn't swim across. She thought she would collapse, that she would drown in the guilt, the shame, the loss of the man she had loved, the man she had promised to spend her life with. But there was no one left to hear her scream. The truth was out. The lies had been uncovered. And now, all Leah had left was a broken heart and an apartment that felt colder with every passing second. She had destroyed everything. A year had passed, and Leah was still learning to breathe. She missed the life she'd built with Charles, but she knew it was gone. The guilt and shame had consumed her, but slowly she began to heal. She poured her pain into her art, finding solace in the canvas. The dog stayed by her side, a constant reminder of the life she'd lost, but also the life she still had. Charles had moved on, remarried with a child. It hurt, but Leah knew it wasn't her story anymore. She had to let go. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others, but Leah was learning to forgive herself. She was becoming someone she could be proud of, someone who could live beyond the labels of wife or artist. She wasn't who she used to be, but that was okay. She was still here, still learning to live. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.